Some people mistake silence for surrender, but the most dangerous moment is when a powerful man realizes he is about to lose the only person who never cared about his power. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors as conversations drifted through the elegant dining room of one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Waiters moved gracefully between white linen tables, the sound of piano music blending with quiet laughter and the gentle clinking of fine glassware. It was the kind of place where every reservation required weeks of planning, where successful executives celebrated promotions, couples toasted anniversaries, and strangers sometimes hoped a single evening might quietly change their future. Naomi Brooks smoothed the sleeve of her simple navy blue dress before offering a warm smile to the man sitting across from her. After spending nearly 2 years working as a maid inside Romano Estate, evenings like this felt almost unfamiliar. Her life had always revolved around spotless hallways, fresh flowers, polished silver, and making certain every room reflected perfection before sunrise. Tonight was different. Tonight she was simply a woman sharing dinner with someone who seemed kind, respectful, and genuinely interested in getting to know her. Ethan Parker, a high school guidance counselor from Brooklyn, listened carefully as Naomi described her favorite neighborhood bookstore and the small community center where she volunteered on weekends teaching children how to read. He never interrupted her. He never tried to impress her with expensive watches or stories about business success. Instead, he laughed easily, asked thoughtful questions, and made her feel seen in a way that required no grand performance. Naomi found herself relaxing for the first time in months. Maybe her closest friend had been right when she insisted that accepting one blind date did not mean abandoning her independence. Maybe it simply meant allowing life to surprise her. Ethan smiled as the dessert menus arrived. "I have to admit," he said with an easy laugh, "I was nervous before tonight. Blind dates have a terrible reputation." Naomi laughed. Softly. "Mine too. I almost canceled twice." "I am glad you did not." She lowered her eyes for a moment, surprised by how natural the conversation had become. Somewhere beyond the restaurant windows, snow drifted gently through the Manhattan streets, wrapping the city in quiet elegance while warm candlelight danced across every table inside. It felt peaceful, ordinary, safe. Exactly the kind of evening she had spent years convincing herself she deserved. Then everything changed. The heavy entrance doors opened. Cold winter air swept briefly through the restaurant before the room gradually fell into an unnatural silence. Conversations slowed one table after another as dozens of curious eyes shifted toward the entrance. A tall man wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal overcoat stepped inside with calm confidence, followed at a respectful distance by several professionally dressed security personnel who remained near the entrance instead of disturbing the guests. Adrian Romano did not raise his voice. He did not rush. He simply walked through the dining room with the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to carrying responsibility that reached far beyond himself. His sharp blue eyes searched the room only once before finding Naomi. The warmth disappeared from her expression. She immediately recognized him. For nearly 2 years, she had greeted him every morning with respectful professionalism inside Romano Estate. Never once had he crossed the invisible line separating employer and employee. Never once had he shown the slightest hint that her personal life mattered to him. Yet now he was walking directly toward her table while every guest watched in complete silence. Ethan looked from Naomi to the approaching stranger, confused but remaining polite. "Do you know him?" Naomi quietly nodded, her heartbeat suddenly racing. "He is my employer." Adrian stopped beside their table. His composed expression revealed almost nothing, yet something unfamiliar flickered beneath the disciplined calm he was known for. His eyes met Naomi's first, not Ethan's. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Finally Adrian looked toward Ethan with measured courtesy before returning his attention to Naomi. His voice remained calm, controlled, and impossible to ignore. "The evening ends here," he said quietly. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. Ethan straightened in his chair, uncertain whether to speak. Adrian never looked away from Naomi. "You are leaving with me." The words settled over the dining room like winter snow, leaving every nearby table wrapped in stunned silence. Naomi slowly rose to her feet, not because she intended to obey him, but but because she refused to let the conversation continue with everyone watching her from across the room. She lifted her chin, her calm dignity stronger than the shock in her eyes. "You do not get to decide that," she answered softly enough that only those nearest could hear. For the first time since entering the restaurant, something inside Adrian's carefully controlled expression shifted. It was not anger. It was fear disguised as certainty, the unmistakable fear of a man who had waited far too long to admit what his heart had known all along. The silence inside the restaurant lingered long after Naomi's words settled between them. Every pair of curious eyes remained fixed on the unexpected confrontation, yet she refused to let embarrassment decide her next move. Without raising her voice, she looked first at Ethan, offering an apologetic smile filled with quiet sincerity. "I am truly sorry," she said gently. "You do not deserve for your evening to become this." Ethan studied her expression before glancing toward Adrian, who stood perfectly still a few feet away. There was no hostility in Adrian's posture, only a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller with every passing second. Ethan slowly stood from his chair, displaying the same respect that had impressed Naomi throughout the evening. "I think the two of you have a conversation that cannot happen in front of strangers," he said calmly. Turning back to Naomi, he smiled with genuine kindness. "Thank you for tonight. I hope you find whatever answer you are looking for." Naomi felt a wave of gratitude she could barely express. "Thank you for understanding." Ethan nodded politely before collecting his coat and walking toward the restaurant entrance, disappearing into the snowy Manhattan evening without another word. Around them, conversations cautiously resumed, though curious glances still drifted toward the table where the unusual encounter had unfolded. Naomi finally faced Adrian completely. "You embarrassed both of us." Her voice remained controlled, but disappointment rested behind every word. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "I know." The admission surprised her more than the interruption itself. She had expected excuses, commands, perhaps even the cold confidence he displayed during business meetings. Instead, there was only quiet regret. "Then why are you here?" she asked. Adrian looked at the empty chair Ethan had occupied only moments earlier. "Because I realized too late that watching someone else build the future I should have fought for would become the greatest mistake of my life." Naomi stared at him, unable to reconcile those words with the man she had known inside Romano Estate. For nearly 2 years he had remained distant, respectful, almost impossible to read. He rarely spoke beyond work, never crossed professional boundaries, and always treated every employee with quiet fairness. Nothing in those months had prepared her for this confession. She folded her arms, searching his face for any sign that this was simply another attempt to control a situation. Instead, she found exhaustion, uncertainty, and something even more unfamiliar: vulnerability. Snow continued falling beyond the restaurant windows, soft white flakes drifting beneath the glow of Manhattan streetlights, while warm candlelight reflected across polished crystal glasses. The contrast between the peaceful evening outside and the emotional storm inside seemed almost unreal. Naomi took a slow breath before speaking again. "You had countless opportunities to say something before tonight." Adrian answered without hesitation. "I convinced myself that staying silent protected you. You deserved the chance to build a normal life without becoming part of mine." She shook her head gently. "That was never your decision to make." His expression softened though her words carried a truth he had avoided for far too long. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Naomi quietly reached for her coat lying across the back of her chair. "I am leaving," she said. Adrian stepped aside immediately, making no attempt to block her path. She noticed the gesture at once. It was small, almost invisible, but it mattered. As she walked toward the restaurant entrance, Adrian followed several steps behind without speaking. Outside, the crisp winter air welcomed them with quiet stillness, and beneath the falling snow both understood that whatever happened next would no longer be about power or position. It would be about whether two people from completely different worlds could finally begin telling each other the truth. Neither of them spoke during the drive back through Manhattan. Snow settled quietly against the windshield while the city lights shimmered across wet streets, turning familiar buildings into blurred reflections of gold and white. Naomi sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching people hurry beneath umbrellas as if the world outside still followed its ordinary rhythm. Inside the vehicle, however, every passing block carried years of unspoken emotions neither of them had ever dared to acknowledge. Adrian kept both hands on the steering wheel, his expression calm, although the discipline that usually defined him seemed heavier than before. He had spent countless nights convincing himself that distance was the kindest choice. Naomi deserved freedom, opportunities, and a future untouched by the complicated responsibilities that surrounded the Romano name. Believing that had been easier than admitting the truth. Months earlier, he had noticed the small habits that made her different from everyone else who worked at the estate. She greeted every employee by name, remembered birthdays without writing them down, and quietly left fresh flowers in the room of an elderly housekeeper recovering from surgery without ever expecting recognition. When the estate gardener lost his wife, Naomi had prepared homemade meals every evening for an entire week before returning home to her own modest apartment. Adrian learned about each act of kindness from other people because Naomi never spoke about them herself. The more he observed, the more impossible it became to ignore the quiet light she carried into every corner of Romano estate. Yet he remained silent. He told himself that an employer should never complicate an employee's life. He convinced himself that protecting her dignity meant protecting her from his feelings. Naomi finally broke the silence. Was every conversation we had only because you already felt this way? Adrian answered honestly. No. Every conversation happened because I respected you. My feelings simply grew while I kept pretending they did not exist. She looked out the side window, absorbing his words without immediately responding. The answer felt sincere, but sincerity alone could not erase what had happened inside the restaurant. You frightened me tonight, she admitted quietly. Not because you raised your voice. You never did. You frightened me because you acted as though my decision belonged to you. Adrian nodded slowly. You are right. There was no argument. No attempt to defend himself. I crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Naomi turned toward him for the first time since leaving the restaurant. Do you know why I accepted that blind date? Adrian glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the snowy road. Because you wanted a chance to meet someone. She shook her head gently. Because I believed the person I cared about had already made his choice. I believed silence was your answer. Those words settled between them with quiet finality. Adrian realized that every opportunity he had allowed to pass had not protected her at all. It had simply taught her to stop waiting. The vehicle entered the long private driveway leading toward Romano Estate, where rows of elegant trees stood peacefully beneath fresh snow. Warm lights glowed from the mansion's windows, welcoming them home with familiar comfort. As Adrian carefully parked near the front entrance, neither reached for the door immediately. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt honest. For the first time since they had met, both understood that the greatest obstacle between them had never been wealth, status, or the expectations of the outside world. It had been two hearts choosing silence instead of truth, and silence had nearly convinced them that what they felt was never meant to be spoken at all. The front doors of Romano Estate opened quietly as warm light spilled across the snow-covered entrance, yet neither of them hurried inside. Naomi stepped onto the stone walkway first, breathing in the cold night air as though she needed a moment before returning to the familiar routine that had shaped nearly 2 years of her life. Adrian remained a respectful distance behind her, resisting every instinct to close the space between them. For the first time, he understood that patience was not weakness. It was the only path that deserved her trust. Naomi turned slowly and looked at the grand mansion that had once seemed impossibly distant from the life she imagined for herself. It had become her workplace, never her home. Every polished hallway, every carefully arranged bouquet, every perfectly prepared guest room reminded her that she belonged to the staff, while Adrian belonged to a world of influence, responsibility, and expectations that stretched far beyond the estate gates. She had accepted that difference long ago. What she had never expected was discovering that the man behind those responsibilities had been carrying feelings he refused to name. What happens tomorrow? She asked quietly. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the glowing windows where members of the evening staff continued their work, unaware that everything between their employer and one employee had quietly changed. Tomorrow, he finally said, you decide what tomorrow looks like. Naomi searched his face, surprised by the simplicity of his answer. "You are not asking me to stay?" Adrian shook his head gently. "I am asking for the opportunity to earn back the respect I damaged tonight. The rest is your decision." Those words settled gently between them. They carried no pressure, no promise that everything would suddenly become easy. Only the humility of someone finally recognizing that love could never be demanded. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment as memories surfaced one after another. She remembered the winter morning Adrian had quietly arranged transportation so every employee could reach home safely during a severe snowstorm without announcing that he had paid for every ride himself. She remembered discovering that the annual scholarship fund for the children of estate employees existed because he had created it years earlier without attaching his family name to the program. She remembered how every member of the household spoke about him with respect instead of fear. None of those moments had felt extraordinary at the time. Together, they painted a picture she had only begun to understand. Adrian was not asking her to ignore what had happened inside the restaurant. He was asking for the chance to become someone worthy of her choice. Naomi offered a small, thoughtful smile that reached her eyes for the first time since the evening began. "Respect cannot be rebuilt overnight," she said softly. "I know," Adrian answered. "Neither can trust." A gentle breeze carried fresh snow across the estate gardens, covering the stone paths in another thin layer of white. Somewhere in the distance, the fountain continued flowing beneath carefully placed lights, creating a quiet rhythm that softened the stillness around them. Naomi reached into her coat pocket and removed the employee identification card she carried every day. She looked down at it before slipping it back inside without handing it to him. "I am not resigning," she said calmly. "But tomorrow morning, I will come to work exactly as I always have. I expect to be treated exactly as every other employee." Adrian nodded without hesitation. "You have my word." As they walked toward the mansion entrance together, several feet apart, neither tried to force a conversation that was not ready to happen. The distance between them remained, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a bridge still under careful construction, one that could only be completed through honesty, patience, and the quiet courage to let respect lead where pride had once stood. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Romano Estate, painting long ribbons of gold across polished marble floors that looked exactly as they had every other day. Nothing in the mansion appeared different, yet everything felt different to Naomi. She tied her gray housekeeping apron with steady hands before collecting her cleaning cart and beginning the familiar routine she had followed hundreds of times before. Fresh flowers were arranged in crystal vases, silver fixtures reflected the morning light, and every room carried the quiet elegance expected inside the Romano home. She had promised herself that she would return as the same professional employee she had always been, and she intended to keep that promise. As she moved through the main hallway, several co-workers greeted her with warm smiles, unaware of the emotional storm that had unfolded the night before. Their ordinary conversations became a quiet reminder that life continued one decision at a time. Naomi appreciated the normal rhythm more than ever. She did not want whispers. She did not want sympathy. Most of all, she did not want anyone to believe that her place inside the estate had changed because of one unexpected evening. Across the mansion, Adrian stood inside his private office reviewing reports that had remained untouched since the previous night. Words filled every page, but his attention never settled on a single sentence. Instead, he replayed Naomi's voice over and over. "Respect cannot be rebuilt overnight." The sentence echoed with uncomfortable honesty because he knew she was right. For years, he had built successful companies through careful planning, patience, and disciplined leadership. Yet when it came to the person who mattered most, he had abandoned patience in favor of fear. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. His longtime house manager, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, entered carrying the morning schedule. She had worked for the Romano family for more than 3 decades and possessed the rare ability to speak honestly without disrespect. She placed the folder on his desk before studying him carefully. "You look like a man who finally understands that some problems cannot be solved with authority," she said gently. Adrian smiled with quiet humility. "I believe I learned that lesson yesterday." Mrs. Brooks nodded with knowing eyes. "Good. Then do not forget it today." Later that morning, Adrian crossed paths with Naomi in the west corridor while she carefully arranged fresh lilies inside an antique vase. He slowed his steps but stopped several feet away, honoring the distance she had asked him to respect. "Good morning, Naomi." His voice was calm and professional. She looked up and offered the same courteous smile she had given him every morning for nearly 2 years. "Good morning, Mr. Romano." There was no awkwardness, only quiet awareness that both of them were trying to build something healthier than the misunderstanding they had left behind. Adrian noticed a heavy storage box sitting beside the hallway, obviously waiting to be moved. Instinct urged him to pick it up for her, but he paused. Helping because he cared was one thing. Taking over because he assumed she needed rescuing was another. Before he could decide, another employee walked over and cheerfully carried the box away without being asked. Naomi thanked the employee with genuine appreciation before continuing her work. Adrian smiled to himself. For the first time, he realized that loving someone also meant trusting the world to support them without believing he had to solve every problem personally. As he quietly walked away, Naomi watched him disappear around the corner. She noticed that he had not tried to prolong the conversation, explain himself again, or ask for forgiveness before it was freely given. It was only a small change, almost invisible to everyone else inside the mansion. But to Naomi it felt like the first real evidence that his heart was beginning to learn the difference between protecting someone and possessing them. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so ordinary that anyone visiting Romano Estate would have believed nothing unusual had ever happened. Morning sunlight continued to spill through the towering windows. Fresh flowers appeared in every hallway before breakfast, and the quiet precision of the household never faltered. Yet beneath that familiar routine, something subtle had changed. Adrian no longer searched for reasons to cross Naomi's path. Instead, he focused on becoming the man he wished she had met long before that unforgettable evening. He attended meetings, reviewed charitable projects, and spent more time speaking with employees about their ideas than issuing instructions. Word slowly spread among the staff that Mr. Romano seemed different. He listened longer. He smiled more often. Most importantly, he never interrupted anyone before they finished speaking. Naomi noticed the change without trying to. One afternoon she was arranging books inside the estate library when she overheard Adrian meeting with the directors of the Romano Foundation. They discussed expanding scholarship opportunities for employees and their families, increasing educational grants, and creating paid internships for young adults beginning their careers. Adrian asked thoughtful questions about accessibility rather than publicity. Not once did he mention how the decisions might improve his public image. Naomi quietly continued dusting the shelves, realizing that the compassion she had glimpsed in small moments had always been genuine. The difference now was that he no longer hid it behind endless work and emotional distance. Later that week, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks invited Naomi to join her for tea in the sunroom after work. Warm afternoon light filled the elegant space while snow slowly melted across the gardens outside. Mrs. Brooks stirred her tea before smiling gently. "Do you know what surprises me the most?" Naomi looked up with curiosity. "What is that?" The older woman laughed softly. He finally stopped trying to manage every outcome. Some lessons take successful men much longer to learn than everyone else. Naomi smiled despite herself. "He still has a long way to go." "That is true," Mrs. Brooks replied. "But he is finally walking instead of standing still." Those words stayed with Naomi long after the conversation ended. She began noticing details she might once have overlooked. Adrian no longer waited for opportunities to impress her. If their paths crossed, he greeted her warmly and continued with his day. When she spoke during staff meetings, he listened with the same attention he gave department managers. When another employee received recognition for exceptional work, Adrian applauded with genuine enthusiasm instead of keeping the spotlight on himself. Nothing about his behavior seemed calculated. It simply reflected someone learning that respect was expressed through consistency rather than dramatic gestures. One quiet evening, Naomi finished organizing the estate library just as the last rays of sunlight faded beyond the tall windows. As she reached the doorway, she noticed a handwritten note resting neatly on the reading table beside a stack of newly donated children's books. It was addressed to the entire household staff, thanking them for their dedication throughout the year and inviting anyone with ideas to improve life at the estate to share them directly with him. There was no signature beyond his name, and no special message meant only for her. She held the note for a moment before placing it back exactly where she had found it. A gentle smile crossed her face because she finally understood something important. Adrian was no longer trying to convince one woman that he had changed. He was quietly becoming a better man whether anyone noticed or not. And that kind of transformation could never be forced. It could only be lived, one ordinary day at a time. Winter gradually gave way to the first signs of spring, and with each passing week the gardens surrounding Romano Estate seemed to awaken alongside the quiet hope growing inside two hearts that had finally stopped hiding behind silence. Naomi continued living her life with the same humility that had always defined her. She arrived before sunrise, greeted every member of the staff by name, and carried herself with the steady confidence of someone who knew her worth did not depend on anyone else's opinion. Yet something inside her had begun to soften. It was not because Adrian had spoken beautiful words. It was because he had allowed his actions to become louder than every promise he could have made. One Saturday afternoon, the estate hosted its annual community open house, welcoming local families, teachers, students, and charitable organizations supported by the Romano Foundation. Naomi volunteered to help guide visitors through the gardens and historic library, answering questions with the same warmth she offered everyone she met. Children laughed beneath blooming cherry trees while parents admired the carefully restored grounds. The atmosphere felt relaxed, filled with ordinary joy rather than luxury or status. Adrian spent most of the afternoon speaking with scholarship recipients and community leaders, making certain every guest felt welcome. As the event continued, Naomi noticed something that quietly surprised her. Adrian never searched the crowd for her. He never interrupted her conversations or tried to draw attention toward himself. Whenever their paths crossed, he acknowledged her with a simple smile before returning his attention to whoever stood in front of him. There was no performance, only genuine respect. Later in the afternoon, Naomi found herself speaking with a young girl who shyly admitted she dreamed of becoming an architect one day. The child explained that her family had struggled financially for years and college seemed impossible. Before Naomi could respond, Adrian happened to walk by and overheard the conversation. He knelt to the girl's eye level with a gentle smile. "Never let today's circumstances decide tomorrow's possibilities," he said kindly. "Work hard, keep learning, and when the time comes, apply for every scholarship you can find. Dreams deserve every opportunity." The little girl smiled with renewed confidence before running back to her parents. Naomi watched the exchange quietly. There had been no photographers nearby, no reporters, and no important business partners observing the moment. Adrian had spoken because he believed every word. As the afternoon came to an end, guests slowly departed while the estate returned to its peaceful routine. Naomi stood near the garden fountain gathering decorative signs when Adrian approached, stopping several feet away as he always did now. "Thank you for everything you did today," he said sincerely. "The guests felt at home because of you." Naomi looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You have changed." Adrian smiled gently. "I hope I am still changing." She nodded. "That is the difference." A comfortable silence settled between them as the fountain reflected the golden light of the setting sun. Naomi realized she no longer saw only the powerful man whose unexpected decision had embarrassed her in a crowded restaurant. She saw someone who had chosen humility over pride every single day since then. Adrian, in turn, understood that he did not need to ask whether she could ever trust him again. Trust was already growing quietly between them, not because either of them had forced it, but because respect had finally become the strongest voice in every conversation they shared. Several days passed after the community gathering, and the quiet understanding between Naomi and Adrian continued to grow without either of them trying to define it. Their conversations remained brief, respectful, and sincere, yet each exchange carried a warmth that had never existed before. It was no longer built on unspoken expectations. It was built on choice. Naomi found herself smiling more often during her morning routines, not because life had suddenly become perfect, but because she no longer carried the disappointment that had once settled quietly in her heart. Adrian, meanwhile, had stopped measuring progress by grand moments. Instead, he discovered joy in the smallest victories. A shared greeting in the hallway. A genuine smile returned without hesitation. a conversation that ended naturally instead of awkwardly. He realized that trust was never restored through dramatic declarations. It was earned through countless ordinary moments that slowly became extraordinary because they were consistent. One Friday afternoon, after finishing her work in the estate library, Naomi walked through the gardens before heading home. Spring flowers had fully bloomed, replacing the last traces of winter with vibrant colors and gentle fragrances that filled the cool evening air. She paused beside the reflecting pond, watching soft ripples spread across the water as a light breeze moved through the flowering trees. Adrian happened to be walking nearby after meeting with the estate groundskeeper about a restoration project. Seeing Naomi, he approached at his usual respectful distance. "Beautiful evening," he said with an easy smile. Naomi nodded. "It reminds me that seasons really do change, even when we think they never will." Adrian looked across the gardens before quietly answering. "People can change too, if they choose to." Naomi studied him carefully. There was no trace of the desperate man who had entered the restaurant weeks earlier, believing that love could be protected by taking control. In his place stood someone who had accepted that the greatest expression of love was allowing another person complete freedom. She took a slow breath before speaking. "Do you remember what I told you outside the restaurant?" Adrian smiled faintly. "You told me that I did not get to decide who you chose." "Yes," Naomi replied softly. "I needed you to understand that before I could ever understand my own heart." The words settled gently between them. Adrian remained silent, refusing to interrupt the moment with hope or expectation. Naomi appreciated that silence because it gave her space to continue. "When I accepted that blind date, I believed I was closing a chapter that had never truly begun. I thought your silence meant there was nothing to wait for." She looked directly into his eyes, her expression calm and certain. "Now I know your silence came from fear, not from indifference. That does not excuse what happened, but it helps me understand it." Adrian lowered his head briefly. "Understanding is more than I deserve." Naomi smiled gently. "Perhaps, but forgiveness begins with understanding." A peaceful stillness surrounded them as evening sunlight reflected across the pond, painting the water with soft shades of gold. Neither of them reached for the other's hand. Neither tried to hurry the moment. Instead, they simply stood together, two people who had finally learned that the strongest relationships were never built through power, wealth, or perfect timing. They were built through honesty, humility, patience, and the courage to let another person choose freely. As they slowly walked toward the mansion, side by side with comfortable space between them, Naomi realized something she had not allowed herself to believe before. For the first time, the future no longer felt like a question she needed to fear. It felt like a path she was finally ready to choose for herself. Several weeks later, the estate welcomed the gentle warmth of early summer, and the gardens that had once rested beneath snow now flourished with color and life. Roses climbed the stone walls, birds sang from the old oak trees, and sunlight reflected across the fountain where Naomi had once questioned whether she could ever trust Adrian again. Time had not erased the past. Instead, it had quietly transformed it into something both of them could finally understand. That afternoon, the Romano Foundation hosted a celebration honoring students who had earned scholarships for the coming academic year. Families gathered beneath elegant white tents while children laughed across the expansive lawns. Employees stood beside executives without distinction, all invited to share the same tables and the same meal. It was exactly the kind of gathering Adrian had envisioned for years, but had only recently learned how to create with genuine humility. Naomi helped welcome guests as she always had, though today she did so with a lighter heart. As the ceremony concluded, Adrian stepped onto the small outdoor stage to thank everyone who had made the event possible. His remarks were brief, thoughtful, and focused almost entirely on the students whose futures lay ahead. Before leaving the stage, however, he paused for one final moment. He looked toward the crowd until his eyes found Naomi standing near the garden path. Without calling unnecessary attention to her, he smiled with quiet gratitude. "The greatest lessons in leadership," he said, "do not come from success. They come from learning to respect the people who remind us that every person deserves to choose their own path." The audience responded with warm applause, unaware that those words carried a deeply personal meaning. After the guests began departing, Naomi wandered through the peaceful gardens until she reached the reflecting pond where so many important conversations had taken place. Adrian joined her a few minutes later, stopping at the familiar, respectful distance that had become second nature to him. Neither hurried to speak. The silence between them no longer held uncertainty. It held peace. Naomi turned toward him with a gentle smile. "Do you remember the first time we stood here?" Adrian laughed softly. "I remember hoping I had not already lost the chance to become someone worthy of your trust." Naomi stepped a little closer, closing the distance herself. "You stopped trying to convince me," she said. "You simply became the person you wanted me to see." Adrian looked at her with quiet sincerity. "Because I finally understood that love is never proven by holding on. It is proven by respecting another person's freedom." Naomi nodded, her eyes bright with calm certainty. "Then I want you to know something." She reached for his hand, making the choice entirely on her own. "I am here because I choose to be." Adrian gently held her hand, careful not to tighten his grip as though afraid, even now, of taking more than she freely offered. The evening breeze carried the fragrance of blooming roses across the gardens while the last golden rays of sunlight settled over Romano Estate. Nothing about the moment was dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no cheering crowds, and no perfect ending that erased every mistake. There was only the quiet beginning of a relationship built on honesty, patience, humility, and mutual respect. Together, they started walking along the garden path, neither leading nor following, but moving forward side by side toward a future they had both chosen freely. And on that peaceful summer evening, surrounded by ordinary beauty instead of extraordinary power, the world quietly remembered what dignity truly looks like.